by all USDA graders. They have this chart memorized, and this chart is used to not only look at physiological maturity, so skeletal maturity of the animal, lean maturity of the animal, as well as marbling score. Now, ideally, we'd like to have most of our carcasses fall within this range right here. We want them to be A maturity, a very youthful animal, under 30 months of age, and we want them to fall within that average choice or that small, modest, and moderate range. So all of our marbling scores here to the left will fall into overall quality grades. So you're probably very familiar with the different quality grades, being prime, choice, select, and then we also have the standard and commercial. Now in markets today, we're obviously going to be paying a premium for prime type products, and then for choice as well, and then select, you have a whole group that is trying to sell select products based on nutritional value. So again, just following in this A maturity, right in that choice, that's where we like to see most of the carcasses being harvested at. And again, A maturity is going to be under that 30 months of age, being a very youthful carcass. So the next few slides kind of line out differences in overall marbling score and grade. So what I've done is I've given you the grade as well as the marbling score. So this very first one is one that we'd all like to have on our dinner table. Unfortunately, to achieve this from a producer side is very hard. You're trying to put on weight, you're trying to put on fat, but ultimately your focus is that intramuscular fat or that marbling within that ribeye. And that's something that can definitely be a challenge from the genetic side as well as your nutritional plane. So this slide here I have a prime ribeye, slightly abundant, so you can kind of see that in this particular ribeye there's a lot of intramuscular fat for there, not a whole lot of fat along the outside. So this fat that's depicted along the outside of this carcass is that subcutaneous fat. So that'd be fat that would be very visible to you as a producer. This next slide that I have here is just moving down that rung. We're now into the choice category. We're at the upper end of the choice mark. This is moderate amount of marbling, so that just depicts the amount of fat that's in that ribeye. And that's going to be at the very top of the choice category. The next slide up here has the modest amount. So again, we're in that average choice rung. So we have just a little bit less intramuscular fat within the ribeye, but we're still in that choice category. Now moderate as well as modest, so the previous photo as well as this one, you're going to notice that in the market today, they're going to be priced at the exact same. So carcasses that fall into that moderate category or that upper choice region are going to be selling for the exact same price as carcasses that are marketed in that modest or average choice area. It is small, and that's just the amount of marbling. There's a small amount of marbling within the ribeye. Now, the low choice is oftentimes marketed in a different type market. It's also going to be bringing less per pound than the modest and moderate. This here is a picture of slot. You'll notice that there is a lot or quite a bit less marbling in this ribeye. Now this being a slight amount is going to fall into select. So if we go back to this chart that I have here, we move down from prime to choice, and we're now down into the select category. Select carcasses are going to bring substantially lower prices than prime, and definitely substantially lower prices than choice. So ideally, from a producer's standpoint, you're wanting to produce carcasses that are going to be within this choice range. The last quality grade that I have for you is a standard. This is where we do not want to be. Unfortunately, there are carcasses that do fall in this area. This one, I kind of gave it the benefit of the doubt. I went ahead and gave it the traces standard. But honestly, there's very little marbling in here, so it's practically devoid of marbling. The color is not very good. Oftentimes with carcasses like this, we not only have color issues, we have no marbling, but we also have textural issues as well. So carcasses like this from a meat science standpoint often are very hard for us to market out in the marketplace. So we'd like to steer clear from carcasses of this nature. So I'm going to move on into yield. Again, I said beef grading contained two factors. It was quality grading as well as yield grading. And yield grading to me is probably extremely important. And the reason why I say it's important, from a producer side, you can control this. You can control how heavy are you going to raise that calf to be. Is it going to be 1,100 pounds? Is it going to be 12? Am I going to push my cattle up to 1,400 pounds, getting 800-900 pound carcasses? So you can control this. You can also control the design of muscle that you're putting on these animals. So From a yield standpoint, this is something that we need for y'all to really help the meat science field out, because those are things that when you're raising cattle that you can help us work on. Now, yield grading, the whole purpose of a yield grade is to determine the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts on a carcass. So this is going to give us overall cutout value of a carcass, and there's 4 factors that we look at to evaluate a carcass for yield. The very first one being carcass weight, adjusted fat thickness, ribeye area that we were talking about a moment ago, and finally kidney, pelvic, as well as heart fat. The photo that I have up here is very unique in that it goes through yield grades 1 all the way to yield grade 5. Now, yield grade 1, although it's a very trim carcass, oftentimes you don't have the amount of time or the amount of subcutaneous fat on that carcass to get an adequate amount of marbling. So we want to produce carcasses that are in that yield grade 2 to yield grade 3 range, and not up into the yield grade 4 into the yield grade 5. So the first 2 factors are carcass weight. Again, that's going to be dependent on the live animal size. We're going to get about a 63% yield. The next factor was adjusted fat thickness, and this is how we measure the adjusted fat thickness. Again, this is the 12th and the 13th rib interface that we're going to take that fat measurement. On a live animal, if we're looking down the back, we're going to measure right there between the 12th and the 13th rib is where we're taking that measurement. The next measurement that's very important to us is going to be ribeye size. We measure ribeye size in square inches, so we will use a dot grid, and that'll help us capture the ribeye size. I hope right now you're probably wondering, well, how do they collect all of this data with this probe and this grid on these carcasses as quickly as these production facilities are running? There are USDA graders in there that have been trained to do this from a visual assessment. So they don't have a grid, they don't have a probe. So when you're selling these carcasses on the rail, this is someone visually assessing this carcass for not only quality grade, but as well as yield grade. The last factor that we have is kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, and that's a percentage on both sides that we're going to be looking at the fat that develops in that pelvic cavity along that kidney knob, which is pictured up here, and the last fat depot was heart fat. Now I have all these numbers up here, and you're probably wondering, why does she have all these numbers? And the reason why I have all these numbers is this is the regression equation that all of these factors are put into to get an overall yield grade. Now you're wondering, that's why the meat science industry has moved to using cameras, right? So cameras allow for us to get all of this data, compile this data, and quickly evaluate carcasses, as well as capture that data and put it through these equations to get a final yield grade. Now the yield grade that I have up here is down to hundreds. It says 2.87. We're really segregating cattle on yield grade 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. It doesn't matter where they fall onto those lines. So here's a picture of all of the yield grades on one slide. If you go just left to right on the top row, we have a yield grade 1, yield grade 2, yield grade 3. And then if you look at the very bottom there's a great yield grade 5. I remember the day when I took this photo, I was so excited because as a meat scientist, this doesn't happen that often. You don't get in a cooler and see a carcass that has this poor marbling and this much fat, and you really wonder, well, what is the breed on this animal, and what was the producer thinking keeping that animal in the pen that long to have that much fat? But it's an awesome teaching moment. Again, we want to take those animals to where they're yielding yield grade 2s, yield grade 3s. That's the ideal selling point for a carcass in a meat packing plant. So the next 2 slides, this very first slide shows a yield grade 2 carcass, and this work was done by Colorado State, and it breaks down a yield grade 2 versus a yield grade 5. And I think understanding and looking at these slides really gives a good depiction as where fat is being deposited on these carcasses. So if we look here, here's an average yield grade 2. You can kind of see from the hind all the way to the front chuck cross section. Cattle are going to put on fat from front to back and then from top to bottom. And then on this carcass yield grade 2, we're going to yield about 66% lean, 18% fat, and then around 16% bone. On this next slide, we have the yield grade 5 carcass. And here's a yield grade 5 carcass, so you can see there's a lot of subcutaneous fat put on this carcass. But from the rump cross-section all the way to the chuck cross-section, you can see the difference in the fat depots. These next few slides that I have really go through each one of these as a comparison, a yield grade 2 versus a yield grade 5, so you can really see the differences. We're going to start here at the rump. Over to your left is a yield grade 2 versus a yield grade 5 there to your right. The next cross section is of that loin region, so you should be somewhat familiar with this cut, the cut that's exposed right there at that loin-sirloin juncture. You can start to see the amount of fat, seam fat, as well as subcutaneous fat that's starting to build up over the top side of the animal as well as along that lower rib cage area. This next slide is a rib cross section, so the ribeye region. You can see the amount of marbling that's starting to be deposited on this yield grade 5, but not very different from that yield grade 2. But you can see the yield grade 2 has quite a bit less subcutaneous fat, much larger muscle over there, and there's not near as much fat built up around that body wall. And then this last one is a cross section of the chuck area. And you can definitely see in the brisket region, to me the brisket is probably the most, or the easiest depot for you to see the differences. But if you look at the brisket of this yield grade 2, not as much fat, but definitely adequate amount of fat. We have fat that is sellable on this carcass, versus we have a lot of fat on this yield grade 5 carcass that is not sellable fat. So, back to the beginning, I told you that we market all beef carcasses on both quality as well as yield. And then what does that mean? What kind of prices are we talking about? So this slide kind of puts the two together. We want, if you look at this slide, on the left side of the chart, I have yield grades going down. And then across the top, I have the varying quality grades. So if you look, I said that we wanted targeted about a yield grade 2 or a yield grade 3 in that choice region. Now the choice plus choice average for a yield grade 2 is going to be $196 per hundredweight. If you look at a yield grade 3, still choice average, you've only lost $1 per hundredweight on that carcass. Versus a low choice, there's a significant difference here. You can definitely see that a lower choice at a yield grade 2 is only $191, and then a yield grade 3, $189. Now, if you think from a producer's standpoint, to get into that first column, in that prime column, you're talking a lot of days on feed. You're talking that absolute perfect type of genetics to get those prime carcasses. So I can tell you from a meat science standpoint, if you take your live animal into a carcass, follow it through to the meat science side, and target that yield grade 2, yield grade 3, average to low choice, you're going to get the most amount of profit from those type of animals. Now up here we still have select standard. We want to steer clear from those as much as possible. And the last couple columns I have up here are reserved for carcasses that either have defects or of older animals. So I want to move into this next portion. I really want to go over yield because this is something that from the producer side that you can control. And what I like to do is invite you guys up here to watch me fabricate down this rib. From where you're sitting, it's going to be pretty challenging for you to see, and I'd really like to go over the differences in these different piles because I'd like to create a pile of bone, a pile of fat, and for you to really see the sellable product that's coming from a rib portion of a carcass. So what I brought today is a 107 rib. So if this was still on a carcass, I want to kind of go back to some of the things that I talked about earlier in terms of skeletal maturity and marbling and things that we measure. And if this was still intact, it would be standing up just like this. They're actually hanging about this angle, and this is the way that the graders will see this particular ribeye. Now we talked about skeletal ossification and we talked about physiological maturity. Well, once it's hanging on the rail, there's no way for that animal to tell me how old it is, right? Even live, it's not going to moo its age at me. So from a carcass standpoint, we really have to be able to determine maturity. And the way that is done is by looking at these cartilage buttons right here at the end of these processes. So we'll look at these. If they are still cartilage, we know it's very useful. I was around this animal during the feeding process, during the growing process, and then I was on the kill floor as we were harvesting these animals. And I know for a fact that this animal was very young, well under 30 months of age, but you can see by this cartilage, and if I had gloves, I'd let y'all touch it. But this is still cartilage. The bone hasn't then taken over, so we know it's under 30 months of age. So that's how we would assess that. The other area that we have here is the top of the ribeye. So I talked about quality grade, and we talked about skeletal maturity, and the last thing we talked about was lean maturity. Now, lean maturity is going to be the color and the texture of this ribeye. Now, unfortunately, I hauled it from College Station, and it's been in a vacuum package, so it's not as bright cherry red but I promise when I ribbed a carcass, it was beautiful. It was very red. The texture is still pretty firm. So that's a great indication that, again, it's a youthful carcass. Now, one thing that you'll notice here, and if you've been in the supermarket, y'all guys tell me, is this a large ribeye or a very small one? It's pretty small, right? So it's definitely not helping its overall yield grade. Now, what about the subcutaneous fat? What yield grade, if you were to say, is it yield grade 1, 2, 3? It's actually a very high 2, almost a yield grade 3. And what pushed it into that yield grade 3 range is the fact that the ribeye was so small. If it would have had adequate muscling and that ribeye be fairly large, then we would definitely be a low yield grade 2, and we would have hit the target point for this carcass. Now, I will tell you, as Brangus producers, one thing that y'all typically do not ever have to worry about is muscle size. Y'all have got muscle size figured out. When we harvest Brangus cattle, oftentimes we see carcasses that are ranging in that 14, 15, 16 inch ribeye size. Now, target size for us in the United States for consumers is typically about a 14 or a 15. So y'all are right on target there. Now, if I were to tell you from a meat science standpoint, things that I would try to work on is marbling. Most Brangus cattle will hit on that select to low choice area. So if we can start bringing the breed up to that average choice, then everybody's going to be purchasing and wanting Brangus product. So, but muscle is something that y'all definitely have figured out, and y'all are hitting the right target points in terms of muscling. Intramuscular marbling, that's one thing that every breed struggles with. It's figuring out what target point do I have to raise this animal to what size, and I'll be honest with you, it's going to vary from producer to producer. Your type of cattle are going to grade different than his type of cattle. So you have to figure out what works best for you and your type of operation. So the very first thing that I'm going to do to this rib to continue to take it down to a state, I don't know if y'all can hear me fine, is I'm going to take off these feather bones. So these feather bones here are what we said determines age. So I'll go ahead and take these off. Now you'll notice I'm going to go right next to the bone here.
Don't get cut, Doc.
And don't get cut by me. As I take these off, there's nothing that I can use these feather bones for, so I'm going to make a pile of bone because I really want you to understand yield of the product that y'all are producing. Now, if we were in a plant today, this would have been off about 30 seconds ago. So they're very fast, but you'll notice that on this piece, there's absolutely hardly any lean there, and this is pretty well bone. So this right here is almost garbage. We're not going to be able to use it for a sellable product. And the next thing that I'm going to do is remove this blade bone back here. Now, the blade bone is an extension of the scapula, so there's going to be a part of that scapula that's still in the rib that has to be removed. Now, nothing on this scapula can be used to eat either. No.
Okay, so while Leslie cuts here, I'm going to ask you guys a few questions here. Why is it marbling so important? Why do we talk so much about marbling?
Flavor.
Huh?
Flavor. Flavor.
Flavor? What else? Tenderness? What else? Someone pays more for it. Okay. So flavor, yes. Tenderness, not so much. About 30 to 40% maybe is explained by marbling. One of the best things about marbling is, how many of you guys here like to cook? Grill steak? And how many of you guys here think you're a pretty good barbecue person? So when you get an 1.5 inch steak, I'm from Brazil. We don't eat 1.5 inch steaks. Have any of you guys here been to a Brazilian steakhouse? They bring you the meat, they cut real thin. Do you guys know why they cut so thin? It's not to save money or anything, it's because our meat down there is so tough that if I cut the thick, I'm gonna be chewing for the rest of the day. So we learn how to cook the meat. So marbling, one of the most important features of marbling, besides flavor and helping a little bit of the tenderness, is that it helps you if you make a mistake while you're cooking. If you overcook just a little bit, a prime steak, it's still gonna taste good because that fat that is inside the muscle fibers, it's gonna melt, and when you bite, there is a factor that we call coating factor. That fat masks your mouth, and then it coats your mouth, and it makes it you to forget about other things. So this is one of the reasons why marbling is so important. Flavor, juiciness, it helps with tenderness also, but also we call as our insurance factor. Okay, and when the meat market for prime and choice is high, it's worth me telling the feedlot to feed cattle a little bit longer to reach those choice and prime. But when the spread is so close to each other, sometimes it's not worth to worrying about. But you guys here as genetic material, it's very important for you guys to, you know, at least try to select for it. And all this here, we call this waste fat.
Yes.
The marbling is the taste fat. Everything else is waste fat.
So some of the things that I was doing while he was talking was y'all saw me struggle with this top layer here. Now this top layer contains what we call cap and wedge meat. So for the meat industry, we want to utilize as much of the carcass as possible and not put it into a grind. And when I say grind, ground beef, if you think about ground beef, that's absolutely the cheapest product that you can purchase. So what I'm trying to do now is trim this down to a sellable product that we refer to cap and wedge. Now once I get these two pieces out, these are going to be sold for about $2.61 a pound. So you see all this work go into removing these two pieces, and I'll be honest with you, this part of the process is not done with technology as of yet. Now the part that I was pulling it apart, yes, they have claws that'll take that off. But the trimming of this special trim, or this cap and this wedge meat, is done all by someone staying there and being paid to do so. The other things I have up here, you'll notice how much fat I've already started to take off this ribeye, and this isn't it. So you'll notice that we have a pile of bones now, we have a pile of fat, and I'm working on the lean.
What do they market that as?
What part?
What will they market that you're working
This
on?
right
Yeah.
here, eventually you can put this, so in Texas we love chicken fried steak, right? So we can put this into a cutlet, make it into a chicken fried steak. We can skewer this type of product. Some of these thicker areas can be put into kebab meat or stew meat. So any type of meat product that we can get a more value of versus putting into a grinder.
What do you grade with this carcass?
Almost a 3. So it was like a 2.9 and something, so almost yield grade of 3.
So think about it. She told you guys earlier that 3 and 2 is our ideal, what we strive for it. Can you imagine how much fat would be over there if this was a 4 or a 5?
I wouldn't have brought a 4 or 5.
But people are fabricating these things in the industry.
And they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice if it's a 4 or 5 that comes to the line, right? They have to fabricate those down. So you think about how many man hours that are lost to the process that I'm doing now.
There is a discount though on your carcass, and it's pretty big.
So if you think about carcasses, we want them to be in a room that's around 36, 37, up to 40, 42 degrees. And a lot of that has to do with the fabrication process. But a carcass that has been killed and then fabricated, oftentimes that's a 24-hour turnaround. They're going to chill for 24 hours, and then within 48 hours, they're already in a box. Now, they may be sitting in that box for the next 4, 5, 6 days before they're shipped out, but it won't be hanging as long as this one has been.
Now, a lot of you guys here slaughter your own animals that you consume in your house, right? So you guys a lot of you guys use a terminology called hanging. Hang for 10 days, hang for 21 days, hang for this many days, right? A lot of the meat that we consume in the United States, it's aged for over 14 days. Because by the time that the animal gets slaughtered, by the time that it gets to the grocery store into your house, that piece of meat has traveled and has been in a cooler for around 14 days. So that's aging right there. And aging helps with the flavor and also helps with the tenderness of that steak or that piece of meat.
So there's really 2 different pieces here, and both of these pieces can be utilized the exact same way. I'm going to go ahead and trim this one all the way down so you can see exactly how much lean product that we do have here. Now again, these two pieces are trimmed down just like this, so we can then produce either a kebab, stew, chili grind is going to bring more if the season's right than a typical grind. But oftentimes these cuts in particular, because they're so thin, they'll put through a tenderizer to then make it into a cutlet. And keep in mind, this is just the top of a rib. This is not a whole carcass, and a very small portion of the carcass that we're really talking about. Okay, so you can see here we have this pretty big chunk or pile of fat here that we have just from the top of this rib. The other thing that we have here is cap and wedge meat. Typically these are denuded, and when I say denuded, they're taken all the way down to this lean. So we have just a little bit more fat in this pile. The other thing that I've taken off of this rib is what we call elastin. So if you've ever seen it in a steak, I'd recommend to take it off. Typically it's a yellow in color. You're more than welcome here in a little while if you want to pull on it, but it's very insoluble, so this definitely has to come off, and it's oftentimes weighed with the bone pile. The next thing that we'll do for this ribeye roll is we're going to remove the back ribs. So this is where your beef back ribs would come from. You know, Flavio was talking earlier about our Beef 706, Beef 101 programs. I would recommend, if you haven't been to one, to come to one, because they're really great. I mean, you'd have me as your group leader. No. No, but we do teach you everything from the live side to the carcass side, and oftentimes the carcass side is what's oftentimes the most interesting. Because you know the live side like the back of your hand, right? You've been doing it for years, but knowing what your animal really produces is definitely something different.
We're gonna raffle this ribeye here in a little bit, so be ready.
Okay, so here are the beef back ribs. We're talking $2 to $3 a pound for this set of ribs. So we're pretty well getting down to where we've almost have this ribeye roll finished. The last thing that we have to do is trim the tail down. Now the tail can be dependent on the customer, so it may be very specific to the customer. Some customers prefer no tail at all. So when you're talking no tail, we're just talking this ribeye muscle here. I'm going to go ahead and trim this tail to 1 inch. You'll also know in this tail there's not very much lean that's left. So if we could pull a little bit of lean out. I'm just going to go ahead and put it here on the top of the fat pile. But this is how you would fabricate a ribeye roll. So if you think about it, this is just a rib. We still have the loin, we still have the round, we still have the chuck, and you saw the chuck on those depictions of the yield grade 2 versus the yield grade 5. That's a lot of seam fat that I'm taking off of there. And even if I take this ribeye roll and cut it in half, so you can see the difference on the ends of the muscle. Your muscle size has gotten substantially smaller. The muscle changes as it carries through. So really muscle size is very important. We want to make sure that we're hitting those target ribeye sizes of 13, 14, even to 15 inches. So it's very, very crucial. But what I wanted you to get out of this demonstration is not that muscle size changes. I wanted you to see the different products that come from a rib. But most importantly, this right here is sellable product, right? Y'all saw it sitting here before. This is waste. This is 21 cents a pound. This is 8 cents a pound. These vary between $2 to $6, $7 a pound. So every part of that carcass is going to give us different percentages, different bone percentages, different fat percentages, different sellable product. So from your side, your target to help the meat science side is to make sure that you're producing quality cattle. Quality cattle that have adequate subcutaneous fat. We want them, again, around that yield grade 2, yield grade 3. Animals that are being killed at around 1,400 pounds at the utmost. When we're getting higher than that, we're having a challenge on the meat science side, just like Flavio said at the beginning, of carcasses that are just getting too big. So, again, I really just wanted you to see the different yields, to really understand yield, the bone, the fat, and then the sellable product. But does anybody have any questions for me? I know I gave a brief overview of quality and yield. There's a lot of it that goes into quality and yield grading and then really fabricating, but It doesn't even have to be about this talk if it's meat science in general and you have any questions.
Questions?
Maybe I missed it, but how did you score that on a quality basis?
Oh, I didn't talk about that. Okay, so if we're talking about quality, right, we're saying that we talked about lean maturity, we talked about skeletal, but the last thing, right, the most important to us, our stomachs, palatability of this is going to be the amount of intramuscular fat. So how about y'all tell me, what do y'all think that the marbling score on this particular ribeye would be? We don't have them up there anymore. So do you think it's select, choice, prime? I hear some selects.
Low choice.
I would say it's a low choice and barely a low choice. This ribeye looks awesome from here to here. If you look at this lower portion, there's really not any marbling there to be seen. So if this marbling were to have carried through, we'd be talking average choice. It's a really great ribeye. But because we have a devoid here in the amount of intramuscular fat that was put into this ribeye, we're in that low choice range.